Hi everyone, so here's our second video. So what I'd like to emphasize is that we began this chapter by talking about energy and the role energy plays within our cells in terms of carrying out the various activities that keep that cell functioning and ultimately the organism functioning. So the two most important reactions involving energy within cells, within plant and animal cells, are photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So I'm going to give a brief overview of both of them, and then we'll look at the details of them, or specifically the details of cellular respiration this week in class. So photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplasts of plant cells. All right, and here energy from the sun is used to combine carbon dioxide and water into glucose. And so the reaction itself is a perfect example of energy transformations, right? Here we have solar energy, right, which is being used to create chemical energy here in the form of glucose. And that chemical energy will be used by the cell later on in cellular respiration, which we'll see. So, as I mentioned, all of this photosynthesis occurs here in the chloroplasts, and we should know these terms as they apply to the various structures within the chloroplast. Most importantly being these three here that I've circled, these stacks of poker chips that we call granum. So if you have multiple of these, they're called granum, which would be plural. And if you have a single one, like say just this stack here, the single one would be called, multiple stacks of them would be called grana, and a singular would be called a granum. And so we'll look at this in more detail when we break down the reactions that go on. But this is the reaction here of photosynthesis, and we want to make sure that we know this reaction, that we know it, that we know the formulas, and we know the balanced chemical reaction. So that's a very brief introduction to photosynthesis. It occurs in two stages, and these are the two stages that we'll look at in slightly more detail. But the two stages are divided into what we call light reactions. For obvious reasons, this is where we're going to combine the sun's energy and use that sun's energy to create high energy molecules, which we'll see. So that's kind of the first stage, taking the sun's energy and using it to create high energy molecules. Second stage is called the dark reactions. Again, for obvious reasons, here they don't use light. Light's not required in this part. So it's more commonly referred to as the Calvin cycle. And here's where the plant cell, the chloroplasts, are going to use those high energy molecules to create our sugar or glucose. So essentially, we have a two-step process, right? A two-step process to produce glucose from carbon dioxide and water. Now, if you're a plant, that carbon dioxide, or that glucose, is then going to be carried to the mitochondria where cellular respiration will occur. Now, cellular respiration is the process by which glucose is converted back into CO2 and water and a high energy molecule called ATP. And it seems bizarre, but it also kind of makes sense in a way. But if we look at the reaction here and the balanced chemical equation here, you can see it's actually the reverse of the photosynthesis above, but the difference being we don't produce sunlight coming out of our bodies. Instead, we produce this ATP. So again, it's another example of an energy transformation, but this time we're converting the chemical energy into glucose into the chemical energy of ATP, right? Cellular respiration occurs in 3 stages, and these 3 stages are listed below, and we'll look at them in more detail in class this week. So I'm not going to go through them other than tell you the 3 stages. We have glycolysis, and glycolysis is the first stage, which actually occurs in the cytoplasm. So I'll just kind of briefly highlight what happens here in the picture, but essentially our glucose is broken down into a molecule that then enters into the mitochondria, and this Krebs cycle occurs, which is also called the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. And this occurs inside the matrix of the mitochondria. So if you remember back to our cell poster, the mitochondria was one of the organelles in which you wanted to do an enlarged diagram, right? This is our mitochondria over here. It has both an inner and an outer membrane. So it has an outer and inner membrane. And the fluid within it is referred to as the matrix. So the fluid inside the mitochondria is the matrix, and that's where this citric acid cycle occurs. And then finally, the electron transport chain is the last stage where ATP, well, where the bulk of the ATP is produced. And this occurs on the inner membrane. And we'll look at this in more detail on Tuesday tomorrow. Occurs on inner membrane. But if we go back up to this and we look at, why we talked about that in class, that there's these folds along all the inner membrane here. And we'll talk about that. I'll ask some questions about that on Tuesday. So what we are going to do is look more closely at the reactions of photosynthesis. So starting with the light reactions, which remember are stage 1, and the light reactions occur in what are chloroplasts, chloroplasts, in what are called the thylakoids. All right, so if we look at this here, this is a thylakoid. So one of these little poker chips, right? And a stack of those thylakoids, as I referred to before, is what we call a grana, and that's singular, right? So a grana is a stack of thylakoids. Okay, so that's where it occurs in the thylakoids. These thylakoids would be loaded with chlorophyll, right? And this is that light sensitive pigment. So when light hits that light sensitive pigment, right? So energy from sun is absorbed by chlorophyll. And this energizes that molecule, and it energizes it in such a way that it causes water to basically be split, and it produces oxygen. Now let's just look at that overall reaction for a second. We've got carbon dioxide plus water makes sugar and oxygen. But what I want you to think about in this first reaction is really just the water being split into oxygen. But what we get out of this are some high energy molecules in the form of ATP and NADPH. So we haven't even used the CO2 and we haven't made sugar yet. What we've done is split water, producing oxygen and these two molecules, ATP and NADPH. And that's what we need that's what we need the sunlight for. Basically energizing the chlorophyll to drive this reaction here. That occurs in stage 1. Second stage, now this stage occurs in the stroma. So if I go back and show you that picture again, the stroma up at the top, this is the fluid. So we see here, remember I circled this one. So this is kind of the fluid of the chloroplast. And the dark reactions occur in the stroma of the chloroplast. And here these high energy molecules from stage 1, these NADPHs and ATP, combine with carbon dioxide to make sugar, specifically our glucose. So we have this input. Here's our CO2 now. If we go back up to the top, right, we need CO2. So here's our CO2 input into this Calvin cycle. And that CO2 along with our ATP and this other molecule NADPH. And I want you to see this molecule here. If you remember, in the light reactions, this molecule was produced. And this molecule was produced when water is split. That water loses its hydrogens, and those hydrogens join with the NADPH. I want you to think about this in terms of how that makes sense. It charges this molecule with high energy, and now this molecule is going to transfer that hydrogen to your carbon dioxide, and now we can sort of see how the sugar starts to form, because now we take this molecule, which is just carbon and oxygen, and we're adding hydrogen to it, and we're getting out this molecule with carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And of course, it requires some energy, and we get that energy in the form of ATP. And that's it. Those are the light and dark reactions. So one question to think about is, where does the CO2 come from? So I'll leave that, and maybe you can answer it on Tuesday. Hope you have a great rest of the weekend. Enjoy your Monday, and we'll see you tomorrow.